All right, good afternoon. We're going to convene this study session for the Ridgefield City Council. Tonight we'll be discussing our comprehensive plan and reviewing, I believe, the DEIS from the county. And we have our consultants here from WSP tonight. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Luss, and then I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you very much, Mayor. I'm Claire Luss, Community Development Director. This evening, we will be having a study session discussion on a couple elements related to our comprehensive plan update, Envision Ridgefield 2045. So the first part is going to be on the county's DEIS, that's their draft environmental impact statement. The second part will be on the resource land study that the county also conducted, and results of that came out last week. So those are our two topics this evening. We'll kind of be split into those two sections with opportunity for discussion, feedback, and comments on both. So I will go ahead and get started with the first section on the DEIS. Diana, can you share the screen, please? And I will go ahead and introduce and thank our consultants from WSP for being here as well, Marty Snell, who's in the room, and Alec Egarola, who's on video. All right, next slide, please. And the next slide after that. Thank you. All right, so just for some background on the DEIS, again, that's the draft environmental impact statement. This is a kind of core mandatory component of the county and city's comprehensive plan updates. It is led by the county, and the cities kind of pick it up and follow in its path. So the small cities, I'll note that Vancouver's doing their own. They have the person power to do so. So this is, oh, where? All right, so we are on the next slide after that. All right, so the purpose of the DEIS, which draft eventually becomes final, is to look at different growth scenarios in terms of land use and sort of compare the relative impacts of those different scenarios. So the county has 3 scenarios. 1 is no change, and 2 and 3 are based on different alternatives submitted by each of the participating cities as well as the county. So on our timeline here, in summer, fall last year, 2024, we provided 2 alternative land use maps and the assumptions for density, redevelopment, et cetera, underlying those 2 scenarios to the county to include in their analysis. And then over the past year, the county has been working with those scenarios to draft their sort of aggregate scenarios for the DEIS, draft up the DEIS, which is a large document looking at the different impacts of those scenarios on the environment, on land use, on everything that growth impacts in the county. So that was released October 1st, and we are now in a period where we and others can comment on the DEIS. That comment period closes November 30th. After the comment period closes, then the county will begin work to select a preferred alternative from those that were studied in the DEIS, and that is a decision by county council, and cities are required to follow that decision, basically. So that'll have a significant impact on our own 20-year vision. So what we're going to kind of focus the conversation on tonight is some key differences between what is shown in terms of impacts in the county DEIS in terms of like housing and jobs output from the assumptions versus the yields that the city's own assumptions, which we've worked to refine based on what we're seeing on the ground, sort of shows. So I'll move into the next slide. This is pretty high level comparison of the main assumptions that differ between the numbers or the assumptions and numbers in the DEIS versus what our own work is showing here in Ridgefield. So the first comparison is the infrastructure deduction. So basically this is looking at developable land and saying, okay, a certain part of this, if it develops, it's going to be dedicated to infrastructure, so that's not going to be land for housing and jobs. So the assumption at the county level is a 25% infrastructure deduction, and all these assumptions are applied countywide. In Ridgefield, based on our own regulations, which require for residential developments, as council knows, a 25% open space set aside. That's a deduction on top of, streets, sidewalks, trails, storm facilities, all of that other infrastructure. So combining those things, we're looking at a total infrastructure deduction that's much higher than 25%, really closer to 50%. When you start looking at all those factors combined on top of each other. And that, of course, has a really significant impact on how much land is actually available in the city and the urban growth area for jobs and houses. And the result of that is, the result of all of these is that the number the county is showing for our capacity inside the existing city and UGA, if you use our assumptions, there isn't as much capacity. So you have to plan for growth in different ways if you have more or less existing capacity, right? So that's the infrastructure side. The second part, where some key differences lie, are the critical areas deduction. The countywide assumption is 50%, and that doesn't mean that 50% of developments are critical areas. What that is saying is that in developable areas, 50% of critical areas and their buffers will be converted to development, or won't be. Sorry, I have that backwards. I guess it's 50-50, so half. That was very dumb, sorry. half and half in terms of critical areas and their buffers of when development occurs, what will be protected versus what will be converted to housing and jobs uses. In Ridgefield, we find, and I'll note that on all of these, behind the scenes, we're continuing to kind of crunch the numbers to prove out these assumptions, but we find in Ridgefield that more critical areas and buffers are protected. It's not 100%. Projects do impact critical areas and buffers. We require them to mitigate for it. But more than 50% on your average project of the present critical areas are being protected. So we want to be able to account for that and show that, which is another factor that when you then plug those numbers in, shows that, well, there isn't quite as much developable space in the existing city limits in UGA. The final factor on this slide is the market to not convert factor. What this element basically says is, okay, you, Ridgefield, La Center, Vancouver, whatever jurisdiction, have X amount of developable land in your city limits in UGA. But realistically, a certain percent of that isn't going to develop over the next 20 years, which is our planning horizon. The countywide assumption is that 10% of developable land won't develop. based on our, recent growth patterns, that number is a bit high to be realistic in Ridgefield. So we're looking at a lower factor saying maybe around 8% of developable land will not develop at all, will stay the same over the next 20 years. And again, all of these are, based on our observations of development over the past several years. That just Ridgefield looks different than the rest of the county based on that. So I'll go ahead and take a pause there for questions. Yeah.
My question for Claire is, are you studying for the bar? Because between the blue and the green, you presented a really good case for the city of Ridgefield. So I think we should be able to win our trial that way. That's what I was getting at.
I will compliment Alec for his clear layout of the differences on this slide. Yeah, it does paint a pretty strong picture, though, to your point.
Other questions? Other questions at this point, council? So just to clarify, we're saying of all of our developable lands, the county is saying 10% of those will not be developed in the next 20 years, and we're just saying only 8%. Okay.
That is correct.
That's lower than I thought. Is like what is the significance of that? I guess like when we're talking about 10 or 8% respectively. What is the significance of not developing? It just means fewer homes, fewer businesses, all of that, right?
Yeah, so there's a couple layers there. So exactly what you said, if developable lands don't develop, then you're basically leaving homes and businesses off the table. It also matters in terms of really the exercise numerically for this update is we're looking at capacity. So it's capacity for new homes, capacity for new jobs. And if you're saying that 10% of developable area won't actually develop, that has like a different output for capacity then.
Yeah, but I'm thinking more about the impacts of that. So the long-term impacts over 20 years is will that drive up the cost of living because we have less areas that are developable that are not developing, so the areas that have been developed, the cost of those developments will rise or not? Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. I'm not sure how to answer.
I think there's a lot of conversation about supply side impacts to if you do not provide adequate supply for housing or jobs, it does increase the costs associated with it. So if we see 8% of the overall acreage not developing, and the county is saying 10% will not develop, like Director Luss was saying, this is more of a math exercise that the county is doing to say, well, we just don't think a broad brush, we don't think 10% of your land mass will develop, which means that 90% will at the densities that they have calculated, meaning that's your capacity available. Mm-hmm. We're simply saying we believe that more of ours is going to develop over the next 20 years, meaning we're going to burn through more of our existing acreage. Oh. So it's more of a math exercise to see what we're going to be burning through.
Okay.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Other questions, council, before moving on? Councilor Davis.
Yeah, I guess to further the math exercise, when we're talking about maybe assuming total population, what is the difference between the 8 and the 10, like in practice?
So I don't think we have a number produced just based on that factor. So the next slide will illustrate like the impact of all these factors together. But no, we don't have it broken down for each of the three on that last page. So one of the, I would say the, main things staff and our consultants noticed in reviewing the DEIS when we received it is that it shows for the two county alternatives, Alternative 2 and Alternative 3, which anticipate changes in growth patterns, that the housing capacity yields were pretty dramatically higher than what we're showing internally based on our own assumptions. this is important for housing specifically. We'll look at jobs on the next slide, but important for housing specifically because, the city is allocated, the county allocates itself and its cities a total number of housing units that we need to basically establish capacity for over the next 20 years. And as we've discussed before, that's then broken down into different income bands. So 5,815 housing units is the capacity that we are aiming for over the next 20 years. The county DEIS, that map that most aligns with what council's preferred land use alternative looks like, is showing capacity for over 11,000 total housing units, which is basically double our capacity, which that's a number we have to meet to be in compliance, basically. Go ahead.
Just quickly, if you've heard from county councilors, for example, and have them say, you have more than enough land for all the housing units you need over the next 20 years in your existing boundaries. So we've heard that before, right? That's coming from this. So in the analysis you're seeing, it's saying that if you expanded your boundaries to meet the council and the community's preferred alternative, that would add an excess of almost 6,000 housing units to Ridgefield, meaning we would be above what we need. We'd have more than what we need. So that's what you hear from them. So that's why it's important, because those are numbers that they are hearing, that they are getting as part of the EIS.
Thanks. So the right-hand column here is based on our internal assumptions where our numbers are right now, and it's very much a work on progress. Of course, the goal is to, as much as possible, not have either a surplus or a deficit, but as you can see, there's really an order of magnitude difference between the surplus you get when you crunch the numbers, the county's method versus our method with our own assumptions. So that is, when you're hearing based on the DEIS, Ridgefield has more than enough capacity. We're showing it's a lot tighter than that. I'll pass it back to you, Mayor, if there's anything for this.
How is that determination made? Who makes that determination?
So for the cities or the counties? The counties, so that is county staff working off of the assumptions that they have for like zoning, redevelopment, et cetera. Staff's work, but then county council did adopt the allocations to the different cities based on that work. Okay. I'll move on to the next slide, which addresses jobs. This is another factor we look at when we're assessing, different land use patterns for the next 20 years. It's a little bit different than housing in that, as I just mentioned, for housing, the county does adopt for cities and assign to cities a target capacity. The same is not true for jobs, so it's slightly less of an exact science in terms of trying to zero out that surplus deficit. So really what we're looking at here is the county's calculations based on their assumptions show that with the preferred growth alternative, Ridgefield would be in a jobs deficit, and we're showing that we would be in a jobs surplus. So creating a significant amount more capacity for jobs in the city and UGA. I'll pause there again.
Councilor Favela.
Just for the lack of sounding curt, the people at the county doing this evaluation or this study, are they actually professionals in this area, or are they just staff that are hired by county?
They are professionals.
I think the main difference is that county staff are looking at broad brush assumptions countywide, and they're using information and data that are coming from countywide sources, and then applying those to each individual jurisdiction, but using those broader brush approaches. So you see a lot of inconsistencies with what our experience is and what our numbers would show versus theirs, and a fair amount of that comes from where they're getting their information and how they're getting their information. And so, while we have submitted some assumptions to the county that they have integrated into the analysis, there are quite a few of their assumptions that were not. And what we know from a legal standpoint is that the best practices from the Department of Commerce show that these baseline assumptions should differentiate between jurisdictions because the reality is different in each one of the jurisdictions. But it's harder to do that. And it takes more coordination, it takes more kind of collaborative work to make that occur.
And just to follow up on that, they, as part of the Growth Management Act, are required to coordinate with the cities, right? And I think all of our preference would have been coordinating a little bit earlier in the process. Correct?
Correct. There is
Okay.
absolutely a coordination requirement within the act, no question about it. And that without editorializing on the nature of that coordination through this process, that absolutely is a requirement.
Yeah, so a lot of this is really truly speaks to the data sources and the assumptions more than any of us individuals doing the work of working with those numbers. Moving on to the next slide, this is,
Oh, one moment, Ms. Les, sorry.
Excuse me,
Mayor Pro
sorry.
Tem, you have a
So this
motion.
was also based before they did this recently released land use study. Yeah, okay.
that's correct. Thank you. So this slide is just a more specific area-based illustration of sort of the broader numbers on the previous two slides. So this is looking at the North Industrial Expansion area. This is that area to the north of the city, west of I-5, that council identified in your preferred land use alternative as an area to bring into the growth boundary as a mixed jobs and housing zoned site. So this takes that specific site boundary, which is just under 200 acres, and looks at, the county's broad assumptions produce this housing and job yield, which is clearly contributing on the housing side to our surplus. That's a big number, versus the city's assumptions based on local conditions, showing perhaps what can actually be accommodated in that area in terms of housing and jobs is a bit less. Right? So the next slide just has some statements on it to perhaps guide further discussion on your council's response to the DEIS. As I mentioned at the start, the DEIS is a massive document. There's a lot in there, but really, upon reviewing it, the discrepancy in assumptions and numbers that those assumptions produce are really at the heart of it in terms of what we look at and say, hey, that might be something we need to comment on during this formal comment period. So hoping to maybe have a bit more conversation from council in terms of your response, your sort of ground truthing what you're seeing the DEIS says in terms of Ridgefield having a lot of excess capacity versus what you see on the ground. We'll have the numbers to crunch and back it up, but your impressions as elected officials with a vision for the community are valuable as well.
So council, I think at this point, as we go into a little bit of discussion on the DEIS portion of it, it would be important to hear from as many of you as possible on the sentiments of this, because this will be something I think that as we go into the comment period that we want to make sure we have an accurate, like we are communicating an accurate sentiment of this council and how we and what we say here, and so it just is not coming from a singular point of view but a collective point of view. So I guess as we jump into this, I'm really curious to see what, I mean, just about everybody here thinks. So yeah, we can start at Councilor Davis and work our way around the table, or as you have questions, we'll just jump in.
Well, I mean, I would echo, I guess, Councilor Wells's commentary right at the beginning, where I feel like as this presentation unfolded, I felt like it was a nicely packaged explanation of those differences, and it's backed up with data and math, and just realizing the fact that the population growth that we're assigned is not negotiable, but like when you run through and you model out both of the scenarios, it produces two very different results. And I think that this does a great job of demonstrating that. And I mean, it's vital for us, because I especially looked at that housing delta. Could we go back to whatever it was? I want to say it was less than half. It was closer to like a third of the housing yield.
2 more slides.
Oh, no, I think that was where I was at.
Sorry.
More on the North Industrial? No, I was looking here, right here. Oh, yeah, with North Industrial. Sorry, I didn't see the title at the top. But, to me, we would be having to, because that's deductions, right? And so then they're saying we would get 1,800 housing units out of it, whereas our model would really only yield 543. And, we talk about housing affordability and all those priorities that we have. Anyway, I just feel like this does a really good job of laying out our argument.
Mm-hmm. I agree. All good. You?
No, I agree.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm more concerned of what they are considering buildable land available and what we consider buildable land. Even when we have other conversations about expanding roadways or putting in new roads, the difficulties that we have to go through and studies to find, because the topography is really challenging in some of those areas. And when you take this buildable land or what would be considered buildable land to them and try to put a housing development there, that is going to skyrocket the cost of homes. And now we're countering what we are intended to do by bringing in affordable housing. It's not going to be possible. So what they're asking us to do, recognizing that this is already a difficult situation, is making it more difficult, and then not taking ownership of recognizing how much they are going to have us tie our hands and not be able to lead Ridgefield with the vision that the community has, but based off of the vision that they have when they don't live here.
Councilor Wells. Thank you, Councilor. I appreciate that.
I didn't have it.
Okay. Anything else?
I just have what may be a way off base comment. If we're unable to bring this property into our limits, what would preclude the tribe, the Collets, from coming down and acquiring it and taking it to their reservation, which then would provide nothing to the county or Ridgefield? And I reference, if you're familiar with Marysville, north of Seattle, there are I think at least one casino and a very large shopping center, which I understand all on reservation land. So that would be my concern.
My mind keeps going back to when Rich Young was in and talked with us about the property that he had. And I can't remember how many acres he had, but he talked about how few lots he would actually be able to get out of it because of the topography. And if you don't consider, all of that when you're looking at a piece of property, and I don't think they have they all been out here now to tour?
Wait, 3 of them, 2 have not.
Two have not. And even at that, you can't possibly tour all the different areas of Ridgefield when you come out and go on a tour, right? I mean, you can drive them around, but still, for them to understand exactly all the different, areas and pieces of property and whatever. But some of it is literally not buildable, whether they think it is or not. I mean, I think we have a pretty good case for needing additional property here to be able to build what we need.
Agreed. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Could we go back to that slide where we talk about the infrastructure deductions? Because I think that is really telling to me when you look at that. And as we look at sort of the disparity in these numbers here, that is a huge component of it. And you can write these off as these are just like, what we allowed for road spaces or, open space requirements or all of that stuff. But really what that is that to me is a true reflection of what our vision is for this community. And this council has said 25% open space requirement on all new developments. I think that's a really, really marquee piece of our identity where we say, hey, we are really invested in parks and trails, preserving the unique identity of this community. And I think that's been a big thing that I have always seen even before I was on council. That was always very apparent to me. And so when we cut out half of that number and we say, oh, like you get these numbers from Commerce, and then what we hear from the state level, we were at that AWC event a couple weeks ago, and Carl from AWC was talking about there's a deficit of, correct me if I'm wrong, Mayor Pro Tem, but it was 600,000 homes? Is that right? And that's an astonishing number to me. And I look at everything that this council is doing, where we're requiring developers to include 10% multifamily, affordable in the multifamily development. We know that we need to step up our multifamily game, and we're making strides there. But the identity of our community, I think, is really at stake here over something where they just say, go ahead and pack in homes with your existing neighborhoods. And oh, by the way, those are not going to, I don't think, like the numbers are showing that there's a chunk of those that will not actually be developed. So I'm concerned about the affordability of housing in Ridgefield, which is already high. Are we looking 20 years on the road and you're going to have the average cost of a single family home or any home is going to be $2 million or something like that? But I think that's really important to recognize. It's like this is cutting us off at the knees, because it means that we're going to have a real challenge to really provide meaningful, affordable housing in Ridgefield long term over the next 20 years. And we will lose also some of those things that have really been a marquee component of that, which is the open space requirements and how we handle our infrastructure. And I think we've done a really good job with that. And I think we've had a very, very thoughtfully planned city. And this is visionless to me. And so it's really frustrating to see this and see the disparity in numbers when we worked in earnest to come up with something that fits the identity of our community and also addresses some of the larger challenges that you see across the state and even the nation. And then we're handcuffed in the process. So I don't know if that's accurate, Ms. Luss, but it feels like that's kind of what we've been up against. That's what we've been arguing all along. And I'm a little frustrated because we've been having these conversations individually and collectively with the county council through public comment, not through collaboration, just to be clear. But and it feels like we're just not, what we're saying is not being heard or even considered. It's just, maybe a singular vision or lack of vision or of singular ideology being pushed versus what is meaningful growth planning over the next 20 years. Councilor Davis, I'll go back to you.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on the 25% requirement. The Parks Task Force that I've been sitting on now twice, it's with every other city and the county, and we got to present, and we talked about our 25% set aside, and they were floored. They were like, oh, ours is 10%, and we get heat from the development community all the time. Like, what do the developers say? I'm like, well, we're one of the fastest growing cities in the whole state. So it hasn't slowed us down, right? We've just figured it out. And I would say that, we have made strides in terms of looking for creative ways to be affordable. I talked about our duplexes and our townhouses and things of that nature. My point is, this is what we're doing is in some ways kind of the envy of other communities in our county. And we've shown that it can be done and it can be done successfully.
Yep.
To me, if we don't get much budging on this, our solution in order to retain a lot of what we want to do is going to be having to grow up and not out. We are going to have to go higher. We are going to have to start entertaining, condos, apartments that go into the sky. And I'm not saying that there aren't already places where that might be appropriate, but that is not necessarily the core of what we've been talking about. But it would have to become the core of what we're talking about in order to retain those types of set-asides that we find to be important.
Councilor Favela.
When I try to envision what Ridgefield would look like if we were under this model where we're going higher and we're packing in, and then you look at the amount of people who are in Ridgefield and the age demographic, we have the largest amount are children who are going to grow up in Ridgefield. We are supposed to be creating a legacy for these children so that our children can stay in Ridgefield and want to stay here. And if we go at this route, we are pricing out our own children and the younger generation to come to be able to stay in the very community that they grew up with. And I can't co-sign on that at all. And I don't think anyone else should either.
Thank you, Councilor. Other comments? You heard it here.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you all. No, I think it's fair to say that Ridgefield does have a strong vision in terms of growth over the next 20 years that our council has developed based on what you've heard from the community, and that is looking at a balance of more intense mixed-use hubs and strategic places versus existing neighborhoods where density stays lower, with some flexibility for middle housing. But in general, there's a trade-off there. In some areas of the city, things will change less, and in some areas of the city, things will change more. I'd point out, as we were looking at the blue-green assumption comparison, another thing I would add to that list is that there are a couple areas in the urban growth area that council has designated as lower density through sub-area plans. There's G Creek Plateau and Carty Road. So that's another area where the assumptions differ across a lot of acreage, is that the council has adopted sub-area plans that locks those into a lower density development pattern versus the assumptions at the county level that would show more capacity for growth there. So just to add a fourth row to this slide.
So yeah, and even on that, and I think about the Carty Road sub-area plan, I feel like we went through a process to get there, and we more or less made a promise to those residents, that we would preserve the unique, layout of that area, and it was going to be lower density because that's what they've always had. And we said, hey, we're going to do that, then we're not going to just fill it with a bunch of densified housing. And now I feel like that's forcing us to renege on our promise to them, because that seems like an area that would be prime for a lot higher density development to take place in the future.
Yeah, I guess, and this is going to another path, and this is going to be our finance crew. Under this model that the county has, what would be maybe some of the revenue implications that we would have for implementing that, whether it's smaller, higher density housing, loss of retail, commercial lands? Because right now, we've done a fantastic job, I think, with investing in our community and trying to keep our tax rates low and things of that nature. And so I guess I'd be curious if we have thought about what implications there would be for that.
It's a great question, actually. We'll have to look through the DEIS. It's something that we can look up and comment on, is the cost of the infrastructure associated with the alternatives. Because, you have all been hearing from staff about our capital facilities plans and our updates to those plans, including transportation infrastructure, stormwater, otherwise. There are costs associated with that. So if you do densify existing neighborhoods, for example, where you don't have adequate infrastructure to be able to accommodate that additional development. There's a cost associated with that. There's also a cost associated with providing infrastructure to new areas. So we certainly can look at that and look at, like, if you follow the logic of the county's assumptions, where does that take you from a cost perspective versus our assumptions in that? So yeah, we can absolutely look at that. And again, this is a draft EIS. So a lot of what we're doing in these comments is saying, here are not only our comments, but our questions that need to be answered between now and a final EIS. So, so these kinds of questions are great to push back to the county and say, you need to answer these.
Well, and I guess I would follow up to say, we should have concern if we're having to implement a plan that is going to create like a structural, not necessarily structural deficit, but a structural, we are constantly losing ground and having to invest in other things and maybe not setting up our community for investment the way that we have been.
Yeah.
Well, and the reality of the Growth Management Act is that if you get yourself into that position, the answer to the question is not change that answer, it's change your land use. So the way that the Growth Management Act works is that if you can't afford the infrastructure to support the land use, then you change the land use. That's how the law works. And so ultimately, if you, in this EIS, show something or see something that presents a cost for infrastructure that goes beyond your ability to pay for it based on whatever the development patterns are or the land use that's being anticipated, then you have to change the land use. So, for example, in the G Creek Plateau, if the county is assuming a much higher number of units of housing to be developed in the plateau that requires additional infrastructure to support it, we're doing this work right now on an EIS to look at alternatives for providing transportation infrastructure. It's expensive. So if your analysis says, well, if you double the number of housing units that are supposed to, according to the county, go into this area, and that means you need both of those alternatives to be able to support that, now you're adding another 40 million into the capital facilities plan. And if we don't have the money to pay for that, legally we can't do that land use. We legally have to back off of that and say, well, we can't develop to that density because we can't support it. So to your point and to your question, it's a great question that we can follow up on.
Being the old dinosaur here on the council, 40 years ago, members of the community had a vision. They went before 30 years ago, they went before the county boundary review board, and there was only 3,000 people in Ridgefield, and they got an additional 4,000 acres to turn it around and carry their vision forward. And that's what this council is doing yet today, is putting forth their vision, and they did not like what they seen happening in the other parts of the county. And so everybody has, the counselors here have all got on board again with what their vision was, what the community would like to have, and sets us aside from everybody else. And we're still going forward with that vision. And like I said, there was only 3,000 people, and we got an additional 4,000 acres because they knew that Ridgefield had sound planning on that part of it. It may not agree with the county, may not agree with it, but we have our vision and we want to go forward, and the people in this community appreciate it.
Mayor Pro Tem.
So what if we did not follow what the county wanted us to do? Does that keep us from getting grants or things like that? Or what are the
So there's kind of two aspects to this. The first aspect is the paper of this, is that every one of the plans that is submitted, that is completed, is challengeable. And there's been some comment made by at least one of the county councilors that said somehow they're the only ones that have legal liability and responsibility. That's actually not true. Every jurisdiction, every city and every county that is a full planning county under the Growth Management Act is required to do these updates. And the updates have specific requirements within them. Internal coordination between cities and the county is a requirement, meaning we have to be consistent with what the county adopts. So there is an internal consistency requirement. If we were not internally consistent on paper, then that could be challenged. And I would expect it probably would be challenged, probably not by the county. It would probably be residents, advocates that believe that the city council is not doing what they are legally required, what we are all legally required to do. So then it would be appealed. And then you go through an appeals process, and there are different levels of recourse and of kind of what you end up getting hit with, between everything from losing the ability to go for a public works trust fund loan to ultimately under an invalidity order. They can do everything from the governor, and this has happened to at least 2 jurisdictions where the governor can actually sanction a jurisdiction that is out of compliance. That's happened incredibly rarely, but again, that's the paper exercise of this. So on paper, you must comply and be consistent with the county. The reality that we are showing you is the reality of what we see and what happens on the ground, which is different. And that's the implementation of the plans. And the implementation of the plan inside your boundaries, inside the city's boundaries, is up to the city council. So when you talk about the sub-area plans, when you talk about the work that occurs, while our development regulations need to be consistent with our comprehensive plan, and the comprehensive plan has to be consistent with the county, through the course of 20 years, changes occur, and those changes in development patterns and development regulations end up creating different actions from a council. And what our job as staff to do with that is to then make sure that we are that we are actually meeting our consistency requirements as much as possible. And for every one of those actions, every rezone, any of those things can be appealed as well. And they can say, this is not consistent with your requirements under your comprehensive plan. Those are appealable as well. So there's appeals on all of these actions, legislative actions that you take on it. That's a long-winded answer, but ultimately, yes, there are consequences for being out of compliance and and being inconsistent with the county plan. But just as those can be appealed, the cities also have the ability to appeal the county's plan and say, well, the county is inconsistent with the reality that we see.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to understand a couple of things as I'm thinking about this. First is, could we go to the job slide again? And yeah, right there. So under our plan, we are looking at an additional almost 1,200 jobs. Is that correct? If we had our...
That is correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if we end up with the county's DEIS, and there's a deficit of 878 jobs, well then, okay, the rest of those jobs that we would have had, like, are those just jobs that will never exist? Like, where do those jobs go? Because they're not going to live here in Ridgefield, clearly, right?
On paper, there would not be capacity for them in Ridgefield.
But in reality, what we see is that we can actually see more jobs based on our assumptions. We would see more jobs than their assumptions for this same alternative, roughly the same alternative, correct? So but what this doesn't show is the no action alternative. The no action alternative does not move boundaries. If you go to the North Industrial slide. Okay, perfect. So if you look at, it doesn't make any sense to me. If you look at the job, go back to the jobs one. Yeah. So what we're seeing is in roughly the same alternative, their jobs yield is much lower than ours because we're seeing that we can get more jobs from the acreage that we have. So on the job side, we're actually showing that we can get more jobs out of roughly the same acreage. Is that fair to say? But what this doesn't show is if we don't expand the boundaries. If the county does not grant us the 1,000 or so jobs that would come from the North Industrial Urban Reserve area, then that 1,000 jobs in the county version goes away. And in the real world goes away, right? So this is paper. This is, the county thinks we get a certain number. We think we get a different number based on our assumptions. But then the real world piece of it is, without the land, then not just on paper, but in reality, there are not those jobs. No matter what number you want to assign to it, there's zero on it, for the city at least.
Yeah. I guess that's, I mean, that's concerning to me, right? Because like there's a responsibility. I think that this council feels very much, and our staff do as well, is that we also need to be planning for jobs to make this a livable, workable place. And so, yeah, it's concerning to me to see that. My second question to understand is I want to better understand too, like, you know, like and Mr. Stewart, you talked about this a little bit, maybe expand on it a little bit more, but the difference between why, like, the data that we use, our approach to data and the data that the county is using to get this disparity. Like, can you, maybe one of you elaborate on that a little bit more to better understand, like, what really is the difference that we're looking at, and why is it so different?
Yeah, so the county's data is based on the vacant buildable lands model, which is a countywide model that looks at a ton of factors, but basically produces countywide predictions for what land is buildable, what land is constrained, of that buildable land, like what acreage is for commercial, residential, okay, different zonings within those categories, what are the density assumptions. What we are using is looking at that VBLM data basically and saying, okay, our low density residential, well, based on what we've seen developed, it's actually developing at this density, not this density. So the numbers, there's just a difference in the numbers if you go through a lot of those assumptions for density, buildability, infrastructure deductions, et cetera. That's where the difference is coming from, is our observations and data collection on growth in Ridgefield over the past few years.
Okay. So there's no like one single source of truth necessarily here.
No.
Yeah. And one more follow-up to that. I don't understand why, like, so if this is ultimately on the county council to ratify, like, why does, I guess maybe I'm answering my own question than asking it, but why is their data more valid than our data when we see what's happening here at the, I'm not trying to be pithy here. I mean, I'm really wondering, like, why? Yeah. I guess that's it, right?
But it's a good question for the DEIS, honestly.
Yeah.
That is a comment that we can raise, simply asking why these assumptions versus the data that we are seeing on, as we ground truth it by jurisdiction.
Right, okay.
So it is certainly, that is absolutely a comment that we can make.
Yeah, that'd be great. Councilor Burkle. Oh, sorry. I mean to steal your show. Other questions or comments at this point, council? Okay, if we're done here, that means we're going to move into the ag land study.
That is correct.
Okay.
And we're splitting our time
charge forward.
pretty evenly, so thank you. The next section of the study session is going to be on the resource lands or agricultural land study, and I will go ahead and pass it over to Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Director Lust. And Council, for this, you've already segued a little bit on this. You've talked about the City Council and the community's vision and how it has been expressed through a preferred alternative that doesn't simply densify the entirety of the community, but really tries to target areas that make sense, but also preserve existing neighborhoods. And in doing so, what our numbers are showing, and again, we went through this, the differential in that, but what our numbers are showing is that to be able to accomplish the community's vision and create necessary legal capacity for 20 years worth of growth, we need more land. So then the question simply comes, where might that be? And this is a long conversation that you all had to look at a variety of different areas where the city might grow. As part of that conversation, the county also engaged in that by requesting individual property owners that are outside of urban growth boundaries to ask them, what do you think? What do you want to see for your property? And that happened in 2023, the request came with a deadline of March of 2024 for individual property owners to get information to the county about what they might want to see. Now, a lot of those property owners came back and said, we would like to be included in an urban growth boundary. Those are areas that then they requested that the cities, including the city of Ridgefield, consider. Many of those property owners around the city of Ridgefield have land that is currently zoned for agricultural uses. If you look at zoning maps around Ridgefield, the vast majority of the area surrounding Ridgefield is zoned ag, zoned for agricultural uses. So when that process occurred and many of those property owners asked to be included, and the council then looked at areas that might work for expansion to create jobs and housing opportunities for the city into the future, then the county at that point said, well, if we are going to consider those that are currently zoned ag, then we have to do a county-wide study of farming in Clark County. What is it? What is it not? What are the properties that have long-term commercial significance for agricultural purposes, and which ones don't? And that definition is key to all of this, because that is the legal definition whereby if it has long-term commercial significance for agricultural purposes, then you may not de-designate it and use it as something else. So through the timeline of this, and as they were developing their idea of what to do and move forward, in January of 2025, actually in December of 2024, the county council made a decision to move forward with a countywide ag study. They made that determination in December. Their staff then moved forward in January of 2025 with an RFP, with a request for proposals to do the study that's required to look at these areas and determine whether they are best suited for ag or whether they're better suited to be brought into urban boundaries. From January until May of 2025, no real work occurred. Other than that, in March, the county staff came back to a county council that had new members to it and stated that they had not been successful in attracting a request for proposal that they felt was adequate to be able to meet the needs that the county had set forth. In May, county council discussed all that, the ag study, what to do about that, the issues around that RFP. Certainly this council and others were active in those conversations, because throughout that time, and in December of 2024, there was the beginning of the EIS process to figure out where are those areas where cities might grow, and included some pieces of land, some areas of land that actually were zoned agricultural. So that work had already gotten underway and already started. So they knew that they had to do both pieces. They have to work together. To be able to expand into an area that is ag, you have to do the countywide study. So in July, they moved forward with that work. Clark County contracted with Eco Northwest to perform the study. September and October of this year, the county hosted 2 open houses on the study. They did that at the Battleground Community Center. Both of them were held there. One of them I attended, the other one Director Lust attended from a staff perspective. They have also conducted some public outreach. They had 10 individual interviews that they did. 7 of those were, I think 2 of them were with farmers, 5 of them were with members of the Clark County Agricultural Commission, and 3 of them were with members of an advocacy group known as Friends of Clark County. They also did attend and present at multiple Ag Commission, Clark County Ag Commission meetings to get feedback from them. So then after all of that work had been done, on November 4th, that ag land study was released. So that was just released, pretty new. But it gives us the underpinnings of, all right, now what? they've studied Clark County, they've studied, what is ag land of long-term commercial significance, and what does that mean for us, and what are the questions and the comments that we have associated with that. In the county's council work session yesterday, on November 12th, about this issue, their staff was asked, has it been distributed to city staff, and have you received feedback? And the answer was yes, the county had made city staff and others and stakeholders aware that the study had been released, but no, they had not received any feedback yet. So that's what we're working on tonight, is trying to get feedback from council, so then we can provide that feedback to the county council about what we see within that study. So if we can go to the next. So where do we start on this study? Well, the study starts with Washington Administrative Code criteria for what is farmland. Because again, there's this broad definition of land of long-term commercial, farming land of long-term commercial significance. But what does that mean? The courts have helped define that. The courts helped define it by creating these factors that ended up getting integrated into the Washington Administrative Code. There are multiple factors, and what the study did is it broke it down into two sections. The first section is 3 factors that they said everybody has to comply with. That are 3 that have to be done. And forgive me, I don't think they're identified clearly on this. So, do you have that, Marty? Sorry. Are A and B those? Yeah, 050 A and B. So, okay. So, you gave me that. Never mind. Thank you. I'm with it. All right. So the first one is land not already characterized by urban growth. That's a key one, and the key one is that if land is already characterized by urban growth, it cannot be designated as ag. Can't, under the law. So that's the first one. The second one is land is used or capable of being used for agricultural production. And again, it doesn't have to be currently being used. It just has to be capable of being used for agricultural production. So then that gets you to then the third piece of it then, that is lands that are currently used for ag production and lands that are capable of such use must be evaluated for designation. Because that's what the bottom line of this is. If it is capable of production for ag, then it can be designated as ag. If it is not, it cannot. And if it is characterized by urban, it cannot. And then those are kind of those are like the baseline. And before we go into the kind of the discretionary criteria, I just kind of want to stop for a second on those mandatory underlying requirements when you start this analysis.
Councilor Davis.
Can you define characterized by urban growth?
So the county study, so the county ag land study defines it as areas that are inside urban growth boundaries. That is how they defined it in the study. Now, there is case law, and there are other practices, best practices in case law that would indicate that it's a broader definition than that. Certainly, when we talk about it, we talk about characterized by urban development as not just that parcel alone being in an urban growth boundary, but also what's going on around it. And also, what is the designation beyond urban? For example, the North Industrial Urban Reserve area is all in an urban reserve. And it's actually an industrial urban reserve and has been for 30 plus years. That is designated urban reserve is an area that is designated to be brought into the urban growth boundary next, and specifically for jobs in this circumstance. But that is not how this study evaluated. It simply indicated that if it was in an urban growth boundary, then not part of the analysis. If it's outside the urban growth boundary, part of the analysis.
Okay, thanks.
Councilor Burkle.
Who evaluates what lands are capable for agricultural use?
So that was the purpose, that was a primary purpose of this study, is that ultimately the county council makes the determination of what the zoning is. But legally, to sustain that zoning classification, they have to have evidence behind that. And that's what this study was meant to evaluate and provide, was more information to answer exactly that question.
Other questions or comments? I'm curious, like, does it evaluate the commercial viability of those lands too?
No, not necessarily. And we'll get into that. So if you want, we can go straight into that. And that's the next pieces of it, is there are, beyond the baseline criteria for deciding is something farmland or not, then there's a bunch of discretionary criteria that come from a legal case out of Lewis County. And it was really to get to that. It was to better define, all right, what do you mean by, capable? And not just capable of ag, because again, it's not just capable of being farmed. It's not that I can grow a garden, in that does it have long-term commercial significance? That's the test, which is a different test, right? And so ultimately, these additional criteria are meant to help get to that answer. So of those additional criteria, we have the availability of public facilities, including roads, used in transporting agricultural products. So the idea being that you need adequate infrastructure to bring products to market. Well, that was analyzed through this study, and it was analyzed, and the study consultants indicated that because there is adequate transportation infrastructure throughout Clark County, that it was not a differentiating factor. It was not a factor that could help you decide whether or not it was commercially viable, whether it actually had that viability. So they decided not to move that forward into the final analysis. And I will say this quite a few times, and it's important, is that in this study, while there were no specific recommendations made, there were decisions made in the study as to which of these factors to consider in what they called their final analysis that was provided in the final report. And so the assumptions that went into this were chosen as part of this study, and they were chosen for different reasons. We'll go through why they were chosen in each case of this. And they did indicate why within the study, in the 90-page study, they did indicate why.
Okay.
So that's one. And so they said, for that one, we're not gonna look at public facilities. It's not a differentiating factor. The next one was tax status. And that is whether lands are enrolled under the current use tax assessment, basically current use. So they looked at that, and they did a lot of analysis to show that lands that are high quality soils under the different classification systems that they looked at, that those lands are more prevalent and the activities are more prevalent in land that is in current use, the acreage that is in current use, than that acreage that is not. They also showed that the parcel sizes were larger in those areas that were in current use, which was another factor they looked at. So they saw current use designation as an important factor to consider. So they carried that forward into the final into their final analysis of all of this. So that was one they did consider, and it was current use. Now there was a lot of back and forth about that because there's a lot of history with current use in Clark County. And when you look at what the acreage is being used for, not just in current use, but throughout the county, silage was the biggest by far, was silage. So hay, it's just people growing hay. Now, what we know of everybody who's grown up around here and knows people who have property out in Hawkinson and has relatively small acreage, but they grow hay on it, and that hay then qualifies them for current use, and the income they have to make from that hay is really pretty low. The income requirement for current use in our county, you would know it better than I would, Councilor Wells. I don't recall it off the top of my head.
20 acres, there's no income requirement. Below that, there is, and I think it's like $500 a year off of it.
So 20 acres or more, no income requirement. Less than 20 acres, $500 a year.
I just pulled up that's what I was reading because I was curious as to what it was. So there's $100 or more per acre per year for 3 years of the 5 calendar years, and that is for under 20 acres. That's 5 acres or more. So you have to do $100 or more a year. So it is like you could sell pumpkins and.
And that's why a lot of it was put into current use because they couldn't.
Sorry, sir.
That's why a lot of it was put into current use because they couldn't afford the taxes, but if they put it into current use, then their taxation was down for their annual installment to the county treasurer. And then after 7 years, the back one falls off and you keep going if you've had it in for years. But that was the only way I could survive. And I can really give one example. One example was my dad's place. And he had an 80 acres. And he got his tax statement from Clark County, and he said, if you think that, if the dirty bleep, 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 are going to charge me that kind of taxes, I'm out of here. And I had tried buying his place for a number of years, and it was his security blanket. He wouldn't sell it. But I come home from work that day, and he had a for sale sign out. And he moved to Grays Harbor. But he wasn't about to turn around and pay them taxes, and he didn't believe in current use. But that's a prime story that really unfolded.
Thank you. So that is a key one that did move forward, though, in their final analysis. That is one of those factors that they did include in this. And again, there's some back and forth, and there was back and forth even with the Ag Commission and their input in this, and clearly the Ag Commission, and you'll keep seeing this over and over again, played a large role in the criteria that were selected. And you'll continue to see that moving into this. And that's actually a good segue. Any other questions about current use, though? All right, so the next one then is availability of public services. Specifically, they looked at proximity to fire stations, healthcare facilities, and schools. And they had best practices about, for an urban area, what's your proximity to a fire station or a school. They looked at it, they did maps, and the determination, and this is important because you'll hear this multiple times, the use of applying public service proximity as a negative indicator for commercial significance. In other words, meaning it's not commercially significant for ag and it's probably more of an urban use, or it's characterized by urban, as often has been in practice by other peer counties, raises concerns due to its sizable effect on existing agricultural land designations, meaning it might have a big impact on this. You know, it actually might be significant in determining that there's acreage that is not suitable for long-term, does not have long-term commercial significance. If used this way, the comprehensive 1 mile buffer would impact over 1/3 of all currently designated agricultural lands. Given that the county has already seen a 38% reduction in total farmland from 2017 to 22, the effect of applying a criterion that affects such a substantial portion of the remaining designated land must be considered very carefully. Additionally, concerns about its impact to lands in agricultural designations also bring into question its viability as a criterion for the larger land base. Due to these concerns, this criterion will not be included in the final evaluation model. Exactly. So the look of the quizzical look that you give is a good one in that you will hear this in multiples of these ones that you're going to see crossed out, is that could have a big impact negatively on the land base of land available for farming, and because it could have that negative impact, we shouldn't consider it.
But okay. How does that pencil though? That feels like it's not a very level playing field. It seems like you sort of rig what is just supposed to be an objective study in order to have favorable outcomes that show what you're looking for. And you're saying the things that do not favor that, then cancel them out. I don't understand how that's even legal.
That is an excellent comment, and it is a question that has been raised by others, and is certainly something that we can feed forward to the county.
Wow. Councilor Davis, I think you wanted to say something?
Well, I was just going to chime in. I mean, to me, it's not their role to dismiss that. That's the county council's role to determine whether the impact is so great that they want to incorporate it or not incorporate it or tweak it or whatever, but it should be unbiased coming out of us.
Well, I was going to say the same thing. I feel like Eco Northwest had a responsibility to present all of the data objectively to the county council, and they can strip those things out and say, we don't like this, and so we're not going to consider it. But I feel like to have a commission study that they paid $300,000 for, it feels like you would have want to have actual data that's usable and to be considered, and you've admitted that.
To be clear, the data are in there too. Like they looked at the data, and in studying the data and then presenting the data at multiple Ag Commission meetings and to the county council, the determination was made not to include this in the final evaluation model, but in the final evaluation model. So it's in there.
Okay.
The data are in there.
Okay.
And we heard that yesterday from at least one of the county councilors asking the question of, okay, some of these feel like they are important, that we should consider this. We should look into it. Can we do that? And while there was some pushback, the answer ultimately was yes. I mean, ultimately that is a policy decision from the county council as to whether they want to include all the data or whether they want to include select data. Right. That's that one. It gets better.
Can't wait.
It's not better, but it gets...
I just went to the food security WAC 365, and it feels like it's counterintuitive to the 8334 RCW that they're falling under, to some, like, it feels opposite in what they're saying. And the classifications to what the WAC is using, it feels like we have more leeway with that WAC than we do the RCW.
And WACs usually do. WACs are interpretations of the RCW, so they generally try to give some ability for interpretation and kind of the reality check of how we implement these things, for sure. And we'll get to that one in a minute. If I can't, I'll go quicker through the rest of these because I think you'll get the common thread here. The next one is proximity. Where am I at? Top right. Oh yeah, relationship or proximity to urban growth areas. Now we talked about this as, what is the first guiding pole here? Is it characterized by urban development? They looked at that and said, that means inside an urban growth boundary. And so all of those areas were excluded from consideration for farming. But what they said with this one, proximity to urban growth boundaries, that I love this language. The unique spatial relationship between agricultural lands and UGAs raises concerns similar to those identified with public service proximity. When applied as a negative indicator of commercial significance, this relationship would affect nearly 1/5 of designated land at the quarter-mile buffer and almost 60% at a 1-mile buffer. As with the public service proximity criterion, the scale of this impact warrants caution. Therefore, this criterion will not be included in the final evaluation model. So once again, potential negative impact on designation, thus not being considered.
Counselor,
Well,
please.
I mean, look at, one of the two that we've been advocating for is the mall property. I mean, proximity to services, it's literally across the street from a school, right? And so, I think a lot of us could argue that the exclusion of that property is more of a Scribner's error than, detailed intentional planning. But it goes to show that, like, a lot more times than not, I think it favors the argument that these are more rural or urban areas, and there's a dissatisfaction with that answer.
Yeah, and really the focus of the analysis for this was really on the soils. The predominantly was looking at soils, and then it did look at, like we talked about already, beyond the soils, what about the tax status, or is it in current use or not? And then they looked at parcel size, and that's the next one. It shouldn't be actually crossed out because that is one of the ones they're considering, is parcel size. Because what they looked at in predominant parcel size is that there was a correlation between parcel size and productivity and commercial significance. Now, what they looked at is that it's relevant because it's basically they didn't want to exclude non-conforming parcels because there's a ton of them that are under 20 acres that are in production. So they didn't say that. They said, we're not going to exclude you because you're a small parcel in there. So like if you're a 5-acre parcel or 10-acre, there's lots of non-conforming. So we're going to still say that could still be considered for farming, but that the bigger the parcels there are, and that more parcels that are contiguous with each other, the more prevalent there is for commercial significance for farming. So that is one that they did look at. So that one they're looking at. But those are really the things that they're looking at. Those are the only ones that they're looking at. It's soils, it's parcel size, it's current use. It is not land use settlement patterns and their compatibility with agricultural practices. Same conversation that we had. And again, you get to the end of it and you get to are they going to include it or not? And they actually talk a fair amount about their work and their conversations with the Ag Commission. And they said that recent settlement patterns, while present, are not occurring at a scale that provides a strong basis for differentiating commercial significance. Therefore, they will not be included as a criterion. So that is one that they're not. So again, what's happening around them? What's the development pattern? How close are you to UGA? Not making the final analysis in any of these. Intensity of nearby uses, not making the cut. History of land development permits issued, no. Land values, back to your about land values, no. Not being included in any of these. So none of those criteria were selected to move forward in the final evaluation model. Now, they don't have to be clear. The only ones that are mandatory are the first ones that I mentioned. All of these others are discretionary. They are just a template that can be used, and the county council can choose among those the ones that they see fit to best tell the story of what is of long-term commercial significance. So they do have the ability, the legal authority, to make a determination that only certain of these criteria are used. But what we need feedback, and we're already getting it, and we appreciate it, is what do you think about that? About the criteria that are being suggested? Because again, the assumptions drive the analysis. Yeah. So when you get to the final analysis, what the study indicates is that over 95% of the land that is zoned, ag is absolutely of long-term commercial significance, based on their analysis using these inputs, using these assumptions, like almost 98%. It was like 98%. Great work. But the question is, like, is that true or not? That's what we're...
Yeah, I've talked to multiple farmers here in Ridgefield, multiple farmers, and some who are probably less inclined to be aligned with, I guess, our maybe all alternatives that our urban growth area expansion. But what I've heard from just about every farmer I've talked to is that either farming here is not commercially viable in a way that I'd heard from one farmer, for example, who said that you cannot farm in Clark County because the infrastructure is not there. So, cold storage, where, like, all of the stuff that goes around all of that stuff, it's not there. And also the revenue generated from those farms, 89% of farms in Washington State are small farms, and that means they generate less than $200,000. That's not commercially viable to me if you're looking at what goes into a business, and you own a business, and you know this. Like, that to me is not commercially viable. And in addition to that, they said most farmers, and Councilor Wells, you could probably speak to this better than I could, but most farmers also have to have a secondary form of income. They cannot live off their land and the agricultural production alone because it's not commercially viable. So what we are doing is by saying that what I'm hearing, and maybe I'm wrong, and please staff correct me if I am wrong, but what I'm hearing is just saying there are farmers who submitted site-specific requests at the request of the county. And they did so because they saw very little long-term commercial viability there. And they're being told, no, it has to probably remain ag land. That's going to be the preference of what I'm hearing. The preference of the county council is it has to remain ag land. You cannot develop it, and therefore, but it's not commercially viable. So they're just going to sit on. Is this going to be fallow land in 20 years? Is that what we're looking at? And are we killing an industry by trying to help it? I don't know. There's a lot to sort out there, but that's kind of what I'm hearing through this. Councilor Davis, actually, Councilor Wells, let's go to you first because I'm really curious what you have to say on this.
I worked off the farm for 44 years to support the farm.
Mm-hmm.
And then I finally retired off of that. I'm still on the farm doing a little bit, but it is not commercially viable. Yeah. And you turn around and busy farms,
Yeah.
It's commercially viable, but Department of Ecology has pulled their water rights, and they have to have water to farm. Next to me, there was a piece there that had water rights. If you don't use your water rights for a year, you lose them. And to be a commercial farming operation, you need water to turn around and produce the amount of volume so you can survive.
Water rights were considered in the study. So if you look at the study, they did an analysis of, they put pinpoints for who has water rights and who doesn't on there. And they did include that because they did hear that at both of the open houses. The consultants heard very clearly that water rights are important. There was a lot of conversation with the county council yesterday, like, what does that mean? And it was not considered as a criteria for determining long-term commercial significance in the study because according to the study and according to what we heard from the consultants yesterday, there's mixed reviews as to how important it is and what it means, and so it was inconclusive, and they heard from at least some that dry farming is a you can do plenty of dry farming without irrigation, without water rights. Now, one of the county councilors asked the question, well, yeah, but how much acreage do we need of dry farmed crops? I mean, we have 98% of our land that's ag. We can say, yeah, it's suitable for long-term commercially significant farming, but we can only do it for dry farming. But do we need that much land for dry farming or not? That was a question that was raised by county council yesterday. So it is still an active conversation as to what role water rights play with this.
Okay, Councilor Davis, and then we'll go to. Okay.
In the WAC, it says, in determining whether lands are used or capable of being used for agricultural production, counties and cities shall use a land capability classification system with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. That was included in here because I didn't see it specified out, so I just wanted to...
Forgive me, yeah, the soil classifications and capacity, exactly what you just said, those are the classification services that they use to draw the maps of soil classifications. Now, there was certainly a lot of commentary at the open houses, and it was interesting because the way that was characterized was kind of one way, and both were true, which is that you had some people coming and saying, well, this is my land, and you're saying that this isn't land that under these classification systems is high value farmland, is prime farmland, but these are prime soils. Like I've farmed them for a while. You saw the opposite as well. You had people who owned the land. The Zimmerleys are an example of that, where some of their acreage is classified as prime in these classification services, and they say, well, yeah, we've owned this for 60, 70 years. No. It's not. So there are definitely discrepancies within that, but those are the soil services that you have to use to draw the maps, and they did. They started with that, and they really leaned into those. They leaned into those soil classification maps to identify this 98% that is capable of long-term commercially significant agriculture.
Great.
I mean, Busy Farms is one of the farms that everybody in Clark County recognizes that name, right?
Yeah.
Everybody goes there to buy things. Everybody takes their kids there, So for them then to shut them down because of a water issue, which is what they have done, So this year they had to go out and buy all their pumpkins and have them brought in. I mean, this is how ridiculous some of this stuff is. It is so sad. It is just one of the few county farms that is actually viable, that actually can support itself. I mean, I grew up on a 20-acre farm, which we grew a crop every year, which we never made any money, and my dad had to work as an electrician to support us. I mean, you cannot support a family on a 20-acre farm, just like Mr. Wells said.
Councilor Davis, finally.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
That's good.
I guess two things. When you talk about the water rights is water rights. I'm not saying that's not important, but the other part is the impact on the aquifer as well. So whether they have the water rights, they don't have the water rights, I mean, that's something that we would want to consider. You know, you take a BZ Farms, if they could get in there, it's like, what would that do to the aquifer for the existing urban areas that surround it? But, you know, talking about the Zimmerly property, and I'm not saying I'm a big believer in planning and, you know, not just having it be the Wild West, but some of this feels like an overreach when it comes to property rights, which, you know, if I'm sitting there and I've got two neighborhoods across the street from me and I own the paper for that parcel, and I say I want to do something, and the county's saying, nope, sorry, pal, you're a farmer. I don't sit comfortably with that, and I'm not saying that the rest of us do either. But I mean, I feel like that's a valid argument of like, to me, it is a violation of property rights where, you know, there is an argument, and not to say just do what you want, but there's got to be common sense that comes into it.
Absolutely. Councilor Birdbowl, thank you.
To your comment, I have associated with a person in Ridgefield. They're in their 80s. They have a fair amount of property they would like to bring into the city, but they can't. And I mean, they've worked all of their lives to do what we do when we retire, enjoy life, but they're stuck. I mean, I think it's totally unfair, and I don't know what can or can't be done, and I just don't understand the counties. It looks like no matter what we say, they're going to say no, and I don't understand it, really.
And certainly that will be a policy determination made by the county council that was not made yesterday.
Yeah.
Yesterday, the final report was presented to them. Some questions were, asked, but that'll be one of the next steps is, do they adopt those findings into the DEIS? Because again, that DEIS considers inclusion of pieces of land that this study, at least under the final analysis currently, might indicate are inappropriate to urbanize.
Go ahead.
Well, so I realize that you could argue the other way, but for what I'm about to say, but my guess is that, this 96% of agricultural designations are classified as prime farmland. My guess is that the neighborhood across the street was probably built on prime farmland, right? I mean, I'm sure that all of it is, for the most part, every part of this county, the things that are already in the urban growth boundary, outside the urban growth boundary. And I understand that there's an argument to say, well, we've already done enough. We've got to cut it off now and preserve what we have left. I understand that argument, but the other side of it is, you are not protecting something that is so rare already that hasn't already gotten the green light. If you're gonna stand on this is prime farmland, well then are you gonna reel in every part of the stuff that's in the urban growth boundary that would also qualify as that and give us even less capacity? I mean, I hope the answer wouldn't be yes, but
No, by law, that is the one area that they did not include, right, was areas inside the urban growth boundary.
Yeah, and so I just feel like that doesn't hold a lot of water for me, because it's like these aren't like such unique special places. Yes, I mean, I get it. If you were in the business of farming, that would be valuable to you. But we've got all sorts of acres around the county that meet that threshold and are buildable.
And to be clear, and forgive me, I should have made this differentiation at the beginning. The county, the consultants in the study looked at two different land mass areas. One of them was land that is designated as ag. That's one piece. The second area are everything else that's rural, that doesn't meet, like it's not part of Duluth or like small, like those kind of Lambert areas, like rural centers, that it's not part of the Cowlitz Tribal Reservation, that it's not part of a city. Like they just looked at everything else rural and said, well, what about all that acreage? So when we say that 99,000 acres or 90, and that 98% of the ag land base is prime farmland or farmland of statewide importance, that goes beyond the ag designation. So they actually looked at even more acres than are what are designated for ag and said, we're going to look at maybe all of this should be, all of this beyond like R5, R20, areas that are not zoned for ag, those could be farmland too. So they actually looked even further than existing ag zoning. So to your point, as far as like how exclusive were they were not. They were very inclusive in looking at that landmass. And for some, they might say, well, yeah, that's good. We should look at like, there's probably a lot of good dirt out there for farming that isn't zoned ag. But for the purposes of designation of this, that was an open question is, well, does that mean, are we considering, county, are we considering designating more ag zoning in the rural areas? And that was an open question because it's a policy determination.
Out of curiosity, is it in the study or do we know, like, well, in the 98642, say, you know, I know we have some site-specific requests. I think it's probably less than 300 acres total. How much of that other area is, I guess, would fit that characterization or is already designated as ag? So if we were to say, we're going to bring those in, but there's still X amount in our area that is.
It's a good question. It's something that we could certainly look at and, you know, and evaluate. If you look at the maps and we have them, we can certainly look at in 98642, if those areas were removed from agricultural designation, how many acres would be left of what they have determined are prime or of statewide significant soils? We can certainly, that is a good question. It's something we can ask.
Okay, Councilor Hamilton.
Thank you. So if we find their assumptions challenging, what's our level of voice to have that heard?
So ultimately, the county council has asked their staff to seek out feedback on the study. And so that is at the point, you know, that is where we are in this discussion, is to provide them that feedback, because ultimately it will be up to the county council to make the determination as to what findings, if any, or if all, they integrate into their comp plan process and internalize, that, you know, that they use on that. So that is, you know, what kind of a voice we have is ultimately it is our voice with our county councilors on that. There has been no determination made on that. There is simply a study that does have a final analysis, but no recommendations. And if you look at like the findings themselves, we talked about them, right? That 98% of the almost 100,000 acres that are rural and not characterized by other sorts of development, that 98% of those meet these soil classifications. So huge impact. Now that's a positive impact, right? So that's the positive impact of, yes, it could be farmland. What we also heard is that all of the criteria that had a negative impact on classification as long-term commercially significant, those were removed from the final analysis on it, specifically because in many cases it was said that they would have too big of an impact on it. So this is a big impact, but it's a positive impact, so that was used. One of the other ones is that, you know, a recognition of the reality that the agricultural land base is fragmented, that there's a lot of non-conforming parcels. There's a lot of reasons for that. But so there was a recognition of that. And then they used the current use program as another indicator. Those are the key findings they had within it. If you go to the next one, though, this is what we've already been talking about, and kind of to your point, is that the ag land study considers WAC criteria that support preservation. That is, it's policy driving data. It's not data driving policy. And that's not editorializing, that's just truth. That's just facts on that. So there are other criteria that were not considered, and the focus was more on the macro level of how is the dirt, and is it in current use, and is there fragmentation. The study does not provide policy recommendations. That's where this comes into effect, is that any of the recommendations will come to the county council and then through them into their actions, where they will make changes to land use designations based on it. So either they will include lands that are being included in the DEIS under Alternative 2 for the city of Ridgefield, including Zimmerly and Mall and Jones. They either will use these findings to evaluate those or not, or they will amend the final analysis to get a fuller picture of long-term commercial significance and then apply that to those. So that's one of the next pieces of this puzzle, will be that. How do they use this information to adjust the land use maps? And that Agland study, that is looking to inform the decision makers. And what we see, and again, this is just factually based, is that it appears to inform the county council that the ag lands in Clark County should be preserved and in fact maybe expanded. That would be appropriate for long-term commercial significance under that definition that they are using.
So
Pay people to farm or what?
That is a great question, and it is a question that certainly can be asked. There's been conversations about how do you actually preserve the activity? Are you paying people to do the farming, or are you just locking the land up? And that is the difference, and it's a difference in philosophy almost that you get. For some people believe that you have to lock the land up, and anything you do beyond that, that's great, you should, but that's not the question before you. The question is lock up the land. Others believe like, oh no, we're actually trying to preserve farming as an activity, so we really should be focused on that versus just the dirt on that, knowing that they have to be together.
go ahead, sir.
The area that we're looking at on Royal Road, past 289, or before 289.
Are you on? I think you might have turned it off. Oh, I think you're using this.
There, it's on.
Flashing.
It's
That's
flashing.
flashing, yeah. Okay. The land that we're having question for Royal Road, and that has all been put in urban reserve. So their land has been locked up. They couldn't do anything with it, and now they're saying we can't do anything and move our boundary that direction. Correct?
That is certainly a comment that we can add to this, is recognizing the designation of urban reserve. Absolutely, and the restrictions like that you just mentioned. That's a good point.
So a lot of this, especially that last point here, the ag study appears to inform decision makers to preserve or even expand ag land designation. Going back to the DEIS that we were just discussing and looking at, our density requirements and the jobs classifications and all those assumptions we're making about that. But if you were to say we're going to prevent or even expand ag lands, what is there any sort of presumed impact of that as well as, doesn't that ultimately prohibit this county from really moving forward in a way that accommodates all of the growth, all of the jobs that need to exist here? What is the impacts there? Because it feels like it's sort of like burning the candle at both ends.
So one of the questions that was raised by a county councilor yesterday was in that vein. And the question was raised, well, if we designate 99,000 acres as ag and lock it up only to be used for farming, regardless of the reality of it or the intent or any of that. But if you do that, how are you providing adequate supply of land for housing and jobs, be industrial or urban jobs? What do you do about that long term? If you lock up all the rural area, are we done? And the answer is you can't be done. Because under the Growth Management Act, you have to create 20 years of land supply. You have to always have 20 years of land supply available, meaning you go up. So ultimately, the answer to that question would be, is if you went beyond, if you actually not only preserved the existing agricultural base and 100% of that, and the agricultural base that's identified in this study that expands the potential for that zoning and where it could be applied appropriately under the law, then you are making the statement that because you have to take the population, you can't say no, then you're going up. And that's the only way you're going. You're redeveloping the community, you're going up. Back to the DEIS, start with that conversation on that. That is alternative one. So alternative one says we're not going to move these boundaries. We're not going to de-designate any land that is designated as ag. And so what that means is to take those housing units, you redevelop your existing neighborhoods, you densify what you have, and you go up. That is the answer that you have to come to if you choose a path that forever locks up that acreage. So that question was asked, like, what does that mean? What's the balance in that? That's a county council question. Ultimately, the county council is tasked with making that decision of what the right balance is for the county, and we are tasked with implementing, to the greatest extent practicable, what they come up with. And that's one of the next steps. And it's a great segue into the last slide, which really is, those are the next steps in this, is we're talking about the comments here, and we still have a little time to talk about that, but that's the next big piece, is providing comments not only on the DEIS, but the integration of the ag study into the DEIS and the impacts it could have on the land use, which is the biggest piece of impacts to your vision and the community's vision. Providing them those comments on both. And then their next steps are, by February of next year, they are scheduled to select their preferred land use alternative. And when they issue that preferred land use alternative, that will then put our staff to work to determine what's next for us. Because if they come up with a preferred alternative that is not the city's preferred alternative, then our staff by law will be tasked with figuring out, well, how do we adjust our paper to be consistent with the county's map? So that will be work that we would then have to do, and our staff would be doing with consultants, and would come back to you and say, well, here's what it looks like. Here's what this looks like with an amended preferred alternative map. So that would be February and March of next year. And then by summer, the idea is to have final adoption for the comprehensive plan, have their hearings, and at a county level, that is what they're anticipating for adoption. Most likely, as we have seen it in other jurisdictions, the county adopts and then the cities take 3 months, 6 months, at least beyond that, to adopt, because the county says, cool, we're done. We've done our work, but then all that work they do has implications to the cities and the plans that they have to adopt legally. So what we have seen is the vast majority of the cities in the state have not adopted, even though the counties that are done in the Puget Sound that have just adopted, they're done. The cities are still working.
Again, at the risk of sounding pithy, would we adopt our plan? And if the presumption is, because it's happened every single time, that there will be lawsuits filed over this, like, are we adopting our plan amidst active lawsuits that are going to inevitably happen?
Almost inevitably, yes. Because the way that it will happen is that there will be adoption of the county's plan. And then whatever the county does, there's an appeal period for that. That appeal period will be running while all of the cities are working on finalizing their plans. So yes, there is a high likelihood that as every Clark County comp plan has been appealed, every one of them has been appealed, and not just by one side. There have been appeals by one side on some and by the other side on others. So there have been appeals on every plan. That will occur shortly after adoption by the county. So yes, as our staff is working to implement the adopted plan and to adjust our plan to match their plan will be under appeal. Yes. 99% sure that will happen.
Yeah. Sounds like a great use of resources. Okay. Council, other comments at this point?
Any other feedback, anything else that you want to make sure that we are sharing in our comments. That's a great comment. We'll just put that at the top. My mom told me.
Go on. I just said, we'll go on record that we're going to appeal.
Certainly, all jurisdictions have that authority, to appeal a plan, just as individuals and groups, any of those that have standing within the community.
I'm just referring to the comment that Councilor Burkle made. If we don't take it in and plan for the future, it will disappear and we'll lose the revenue for the county and the state and Ridgefield. Because it'll go to the entity to the north.
This is why it's so important who we elect to be on the county council. A lot of people don't even recognize the role that they play or what they do, and they just go, who is it, But this is the importance of it, one of the key things.
Okay. Does staff have what you need from council at this point?
Thank you, Mayor. I believe we do have
Okay.
everything we need from this study session.
Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Maybe they should also consider what collaboration, how they define collaboration versus how we define collaboration. I think that's important when working with different jurisdictions and maybe adjusting the way that you communicate to be more effective with said collaboration.
I think that's an underrated comment, Counselor, and that we've spent months showing up in 3 minutes at a time and also demanding that we follow the RCW and collaborate on it. And it ultimately led to one session that was sort of performative versus anything else. But I guess for comments, I would like to make sure that we insist that collaboration is still necessary, and we need to continue collaborating on it and not just 3 minutes at a time. Anybody else? Okay.
I think we should nominate Mayor Pro Tem Chipman to run against the county.
Okay, let's, yes. Easy. That's a conversation for outside of a public meeting in your political lives. Okay. Anybody else have any comments on the policy side of things? Okay. Sounds good. Thank you again for preparing that. Marty, thank you for coming up. It's good to see you. Thanks, Council, for your thoughtfulness and your questions here. More to come on it, obviously. So I guess with that, we will conclude our study session today. Thank you, everybody.